Welcome to Drink Beer, Think Beer, the podcast that gets to the bottom of every pint. I'm John Holl, and love it or hate it, there's a lot you don't know about Malort. Josh Noel, the great author and newspaperman, is here to talk about his new book on the Revered and Reviled Spirit and its unique Chicago story. First, please go visit allaboutbeer.com. There, you can find original articles, reviews, news, insights, and other podcasts. Listen to shows like Brewer to Brewer and the All About Beer podcast simply by searching All About Beer wherever you listen to shows. You can also follow All About Beer on Instagram, Threads, X, and Facebook at All About Beer. And to keep up with all of the smoked beer news and releases, make sure you check out This Week in Rauch Beer by searching the group on Facebook or follow at TW Rauch Beer on X, Threads, and Instagram. Glassware and apparel is available on allaboutbeer.com/merch. This show and all of the work we do, it's supported by you. Please go visit patreon.com/allaboutbeer. A few dollars goes a long way to help fund writers, photographers, creators, and editors. And if you'd like to learn more about advertising and supporting All About Beer, please email us at info@allaboutbeer.com. I remember the first time I had Malort, the yellow-tinted wormwood spirit that was once only served in Chicagoland bars. I was at Patty Long's, which is a great beer bar, when I was offered a shot. It tasted like depression and rusty barbed wire, and I was totally intrigued. The Spirit is a story of stubbornness and luck, determination and underground appreciation, and the story could only be told by a reporter like Josh Noel. He's a longtime Chicago Tribune reporter, and you'll remember that he is also the author of Barrel-Aged Stouts and Selling Out, the story of Goose Island Brewery, another Chicago drinking institution. In his new book, Malort, The Redemption of a Revered and Reviled Spirit, he traces the story's brand's origin, how it survived, rode the wave of modern cocktail bars and craft beer, and eventually grew and become beloved by many. Personally, I've been a fan of the Spirit since that first sip, and I keep a bottle at the house. I like it even more now, having read Noel's book, and I think you'll feel the same. Go get a copy where fine books are sold, and listen in now as he takes us through the story. Here's our conversation. I want to turn a question around on you. So towards the end of the book, and spoiler, Malort gets sold at some point in the telling of this book. And the question is, why did you want to buy Malort, buy the company? And so I'm turning that question around on you a little bit of why did you want to write about Malort?
It's the most basic of questions, but it's one of the most interesting and fun to answer because it is a singular, excuse me, it is a singular subject. There's very little else like Malort. There's nothing like Malort, and that includes the relationship that the people who appreciate, love Malort have with Malort. It's just got this unique power as a brand and as a product. And part of its lore and reputation, of course, is that it's terrible and it's so bitter and it's impossible to drink and I hate it, but you have to try it, that whole thing. A lot of people genuinely like it, and I'm among them. I always have historically kept a bottle at home. Do you keep a bottle at home?
I have a bottle here at the house, yeah.
Excellent. And I am truly a believer in Malort's power to settle the stomach after a large meal, which is
the medicinal purposes of which early on, that was the selling point around it.
Yeah, completely. And so one night after a large meal, I took a shot of Malort in my kitchen. And at that moment in time, I was also sort of casting about for what my next book would be. And it was just one of those proverbial light bulb moments where I realized people are fascinated by this thing. People love this thing. People hate this thing. People love to talk and think about this thing, but we don't really know that much about it. Its story just is not understood. We knew maybe 5% of the Malort story in reality. And it occurred to me that there could be a book length answer in uncovering the rest. Um, and I was off.
And that's so interesting to me because so do you remember your first taste of Malort?
I do. It was at a bar in Chicago called the Whistler. It was sort of one of the modern cocktail bars. This was back in, geez, maybe 2009 or something like that. It was the beginning, at least in Chicago, of the craft cocktail and cocktail bar revolution, which is a subject that I wound up getting into in the book pretty heavily because I think it's tied into what allowed Malort to become Malort in its current incarnation. But yeah, I had that first taste, and I thought it was a jarring and surprising flavor to me. Very bitter, very astringent, like chewing. To me, it tastes like a combination of chewing on grapefruit pith and rubber bands, with, of course, some booziness in there, a lot of booziness. And I thought it was I just thought it was strange. I didn't really understand what it was doing, but I also didn't hate it at all. That was the time that I was getting into, um, big IPAs. There was the IBU arms race was underway, and craft beer was at the beginning of a really exciting time. And maybe a couple years before that, I'd had my first really hoppy beer. I was probably a few years at that point, and I still remember that. That was at a bar called Sheffield's in Chicago, and I was
I know of it.
newer
Yeah.
to. Oh, it's great, great legendary bar here. I was kind of newer to understanding craft beer, and I think I was one of those early guys who walked in and said, "What IPAs do you have?" This was maybe 2005 or something like that. And I remember the bartender said, "We've got this uh, beer from called Racer 5 from a brewery in California called Bear Republic, and it's really hoppy. I'm just going to warn you." And I said, "Okay, I'll try that." And he poured it for me, and I had never tasted anything like it. It blew my mind. And back in 2005, I haven't tasted that beer in a long time. I don't know if they've made any tweaks or anything, but wow, yeah, that was just hop overload. But it was also really exciting and really bitter, to someone who had been drinking. I don't even know what I'd been drinking at that point. Probably a lot of amber ales and stuff like that. And maybe even the occasional pale ale, but nothing like Racer 5 at that point. So anyway, that's a very long way of saying that my palate had started, turning toward finding bitter, bitter flavors, and especially bitter beer really interesting. So Malort didn't completely blow my socks off, but it obviously has a different profile than a heavily hopped West Coast IPA. But it still felt sort of okay. I can sort of understand what's going on here somewhat. And it stuck with me, but I didn't really think about it a whole lot for a while after that. Not really until I started writing about booze and drinks and beer and stuff like that for the Chicago Tribune, because Malort was slowly becoming a cultural force here. And at that point, I, of course, had to start thinking more about it.
So the cultural force thing is so interesting to me because my first interaction with it was in January of 2013 at Patty Long's.
Perfect. Yeah,
And
that was the heyday of when things are really getting
yeah,
exciting and
and
going.
that bar, I mean, I didn't know it at the time. I was just there and it was, I was like offered a shot and I, took it and, I remember, thinking like, oh, this is depression and barbed wire. And it was but enjoyable in that sort of fun way. And I had a pin that is somewhere in a box somewhere that said I got malorted um at the time. And it was, but in this book, Patty Longs really figures into much of the resurgence, much of the story.
Yeah,
And
Patty Longs was part of the epicenter for sure as things really got going.
I just at the time though, I sort of took it for granted of like, oh, this is just a Chicago thing. I'm not from Chicago. But that it had really been dormant or barely dormant, or mostly dormant, I should say, um, for the previous, what, 30 years,
Yeah.
is incredible that it just chugged along in the way that it did. And I wonder if you can sort of, sum it up for us as best you can, because I want people to go read the book. But for me, this reading this book, it really is a story of both passion but also stubbornness. Is
And
that fair?
oh yeah, totally. Passion, stubbornness, and just kind of happenstance and good luck. I mean, Malort really should not exist today. There are so many moments along the way, and it goes back that we don't know exactly how old the product is, what year it was first rolled out in Chicago by Swedish immigrant Carl Jeppson, but it was probably the 1920s, could have been the 1930s. So it's almost 100 years old, and there are so many moments in time where it could have and probably should have just disappeared, and no one would have even really noticed or cared. But there is just this web of people and relationships, and uh and yeah, at some points it turns into luck, at some points it's stubbornness, and at some point there it's just about love. And this product, against all odds, survived. And so back to your first question,
Yeah.
that was the story that I didn't know that what the answer was to, well, how did Malort become what it is? I didn't know what the answer would be or how interesting the answer would be. It turned out to be fascinating and really fun to delve into, because at heart it's really the narrative is not just about Malort, but about the people and the relationships that allowed it over these 100 years to become what it is today, and to find its place in culture. Um, yeah, no, it was people say, when I would tell people I was writing a book about Malort, they'd say, "So are you writing a history of Malort?" And I'd say, "Well, kind of, but not really. It's kind of more than that. It's really about, like I said, the people and relationships." Yeah, it's sort of hard to explain because you think of it as just like the history of a product, but the history of the product isn't that interesting unto itself, because the product hasn't really changed over the last 100 years. It says everything changed around it, and
Yeah.
that was the fun and interesting story to tell.
But I mean, it's also a story of entrepreneurship and of, it's a love story, at certain points, and it's, corporate intrigue and lawsuits, and like I found myself as I was reading it, um, really excited to know what comes next, because the end result, like, it's around and thriving now, but the road for it to get there was anything but a straight line. And these personal stories that you're telling, and digging up old history, and I have to ask, I mean, my God, the amount of source material that it seems you had access to is every writer's dream.
Oh yeah, yeah, that was a great day. So basically the whole project started with me. So Malort was owned by this man George Brody for how long would it have been? 64 years. And what was known was that he owned Malort for a long time, and that when he died in 1999, he left the brand to his secretary, and then she operated Malort for wound up being close to 20 years. And that would raise anyone's eye, right? So why then? And that was one of the things that made me want to write about it. Was, wait a second, this guy left the brand to his secretary? What's going on there?
Right.
So that was the only way to begin the book, to begin reporting the book, was to pick up the phone and call the secretary. And I did that. It was late 2021, and I found her number, somewhere online or something, and she didn't answer. As people do or don't when they don't recognize the phone number. And I started babbling into her answering machine about, hi, I'm this reporter and I want to write about Malort and I think it's interesting. And she picked up the phone and she started talking and we talked for about an hour. And her name was Pat Gablick, just a wonderful, wonderful woman.
Yeah.
And then we spent the next 2 years talking and just really came to, I think, appreciate each other. She's 81 years old now. Hopefully she doesn't mind me saying that. And she was just a delightful person to spend 2 years getting to know. And she was just very, very open to the project and answered all my questions. And at one point, so this gets back to what you were just nodding to, let me come to her condo, and
which features prominently in the book, this location.
Yeah. It was the nerve center of Malort, this condominium on Lakeshore Drive. A very unlikely headquarters for Malort for as long as it was.
But somehow also fitting.
Yeah, well, it completely fit sort of the weirdness of the whole story. The fact that there was some weirdness there made it very, very fun to work on. But at one point, she finally let me come over and just go through her storage bin, and she just had box upon box of old Malort stuff. And at one point, I think there were twice as many boxes, and she just threw a bunch of them out when she sold the company, which of course was hard to hear. But fortunately, she also saved a ton. And she said, take whatever you want. And this was kind of earlier in COVID. So we were both masked because I didn't want to get this, I think she was maybe 79 at the time, the 79-year-old woman sick. And so we were both wearing masks in the basement of her condo building. She was in a folding chair. I was sweating and grunting and getting dirty from moving all these boxes around, trying to figure out what was in all them. And she let me. We got a dolly, and I think I took 5 or 6 boxes home, just crammed with stuff. And she said, yeah, just use whatever you want. And there was so much interesting stuff there. So yes, it was a journalist dream. I really wasn't sure when I started that there would be a book in the subject, but the people were so interesting. The relationships were so interesting. The people were so generally willing to talk to me and reflect on everything that had happened.
Because there's a lot of intrigue in the book. There's a lot of hurt feelings that start to show up towards the end. And again, reading this, and I don't want to spoil it for people because I want people to go and read the book, but it was very clear that these people opened up their lives from this point in their lives to you in a way that you were able to craft this wonderful narrative. And again, sort of a writer's dream, a reporter's dream.
Yeah, I got lucky on so many turns here. Pat was really open with me about her own personal life and about the business. She made all her files available to me. And then there are some other really, I think, interesting characters. There's a guy named Peter Strom who
the historian. Yeah.
Yep. Peter's a great guy, a thoughtful guy. He was really open with me, and it's kind of hard to explain. Hopefully it comes through in the book, but just so he was a young guy. He was about 29, I think, when he reached out to Pat, and I can't even remember what year it was now off the top of my head. It's in the book. It was maybe 2010 or 2011, something like that. And he was the first person to reach out to Pat and say, I love Malort, because Malort was starting to change in the cultural fabric at that point. And so Peter reflected that. And Peter was a Swedish guy, meaning his family was Swedish. He loved Chicago bar culture. He loved Chicago history, and Malort sort of hit all those points and just fascinated him. So he reached out to Pat and said, I would love to work on this project with you. And it turned out Malort at that point was being run by Pat Gablick alone in her Lakeshore Drive condominium. So she needed the help. And she didn't really believe what Peter was saying in terms of Malort catching on with this new audience, because she was, she didn't have a marketing team or a sales team. She barely ever even talked to her distributors. She had no idea what was going on with her own brand in the bars. But Peter knew, And so Peter started volunteering to work with her, and he loved Malort. It just because it had this authenticity to it, it had this strong point of view, and it just was this living piece of Chicago history. And he loved it. And Peter wound up leaving the company, and there were a lot of hurt feelings. But enough time had passed where he was really open with me and thoughtful with me. I spent so much time on the phone with Peter, and we met several times too. And I would text him all the time because he really was trying to tell the Malort story before I was.
Yeah.
But he was trying to sort of piece the history together back in about 2010 or so.
And what's funny is there's parallels, right? Where you're talking about being at Pat's condo and looking through boxes and saying that she threw a bunch away. I remember there's a scene in the book where he goes and meets Pat for the first time, and she mentions that she used to have more boxes and threw a lot of stuff away, but what she kept was so valuable and so important. It just it seems like, Pat was always throwing away boxes.
Yeah, well, when George, so she had two major purges. So the first one, I guess, would have been I guess it would have been in 1999 when George died. And so that was what she told Peter about, is she had a ton of stuff back then. And Peter was fascinated to try to reassemble the history of Malort, because at that point, really nothing was known. We didn't even know whether there was a man named Carl Jepsen who started the brand or not. And Peter did the work to figure that out. And then Pat would have had a second purge, which was when she sold the company in 2018. And that was when I was like, oh man, I wish you still had some of that stuff. And even she said at that point, oh, I should have saved some of that stuff. But fortunately, she held on to a lot. But yeah, and then there was another guy, Sam Meckling, who got involved. Sam became very much the public face of Malort as it entered the mainstream and became this cult product. And Sam also wound up leaving, and it was very hurtful for him as well. Different contexts for Peter and Sam. But so, yeah, point is Peter was really open and thoughtful with me. Sam was really open and thoughtful with me. And they're great guys, and just such smart guys and thoughtful guys. And they were both everyone was, there was a lot of passion and feeling for the brand from the people who were involved with it. And I think, and then at the end of the day, they were really open to talking about it and reflecting on it. I think especially because Malort is now sort of safe. Like it really could have disappeared at any point along the way for a long time. And now that's not going to happen. Now it's owned by a distillery that makes a lot of it and sells a lot of it. And the brand is now secure, but it wasn't necessarily the case for a long time. So I think now that it is, and these guys had this role in getting it there, they were really open to talking about it and reflecting on it. And I asked them some hard questions about, some of the stuff that went down along the way. And people were just open and really thoughtful. And I was just really lucky to be able to tell the story. And yeah, it was really fun to work on.
And one of the things that you do, this sort of slow reveal, this sort of wink nod early on, right? And you refer to Pat as the secretary.
Right.
And in the early conversations when she's talking with Sam, Peter, and Chris, and some of the other quote unquote volunteers that were coming on and helping her in those early days, it was always sort of that unspoken thing of secretary with a raised eyebrow.
Right.
And it seems like obviously she was more than that, much more than that. And it seems like she opened up about that relationship with George to you for the book.
She did. And other people had poked at it along the way over the years. But she was never really ready to talk about it. In part, I think, certainly while she still owned the brand,
right?
She still sort of cloaked that whole thing in mystery. But yeah, by the time I reached out, she had sold the brand about 4 years earlier. Again, she was in her later 70s at that point. And there was just, I don't, she wasn't embarrassed or she didn't have anything to hide. It's just maybe at a certain point in time, it didn't feel quite like something that should be discussed. But now it didn't matter anymore. And she was just open. And yeah, there was a lot there. It was really interesting. And I wondered how people would react. And, as we're talking, still will react because the book isn't even out yet. Though, the media who have read it, I've heard some really heartening and heartwarming things. It's been wonderful. But I'm curious how people will react to sort of the Pat and George relationship, because I think it's really interesting, and it wasn't conventional by
No.
any stretch. But it's like Tim Walz said at the DNC. We just stay out of other people's damn business. It's just different things work for different people, different lives, travel different paths. And Pat and George had a very unique dynamic and experience, and a happy one. They really
Yeah.
cared about each other. And the result of it is Malort continues to exist.
George himself is a fascinating person to read about in this book, and his background as a lawyer, his marketing prowess, his even brushes with the law
Right.
in the past. I mean, there's
That was a surprise that turned up in the in the reporting. That was the one thing, and I don't know if we should reveal it or not.
sure.
That was one subject that I was a little concerned to broach with Pat. But I did in the end, and it was all fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, George had a brush with the law. We'll tease you with that. How about that?
Yeah, I like that. Um, but it just it strikes me that the people who have been around Malort keeping it going were I guess, as complex as the spirit itself is.
Yeah.
Um, for a spirit that's not actually all that complex. I mean, when Florida distillers sent the recipe over to the New Chicago distillery, what did they say? It was like 14 steps. Like you called it like making brownies, like a brownie recipe. Um, I guess I want to touch on that just a little bit for those who haven't had it before, and all jokey things aside. But what is Malort?
Malort it's a simple product. It's basically neutral spirit, so vodka, essentially, uh, that sits on wormwood, which is a bitter herb. Um, I can't remember. Maybe it spends 2 or 3 weeks
Soaking it
mingling.
in. Yeah.
Yeah. And the vodka slash neutral spirit absorbs the bitterness, and then it's filtered, and then it gets a little bit of sugar to balance it. Otherwise, it would just be completely unpalatable. Instead, it's just mostly unpalatable. And that's it. It's a wonderfully simple product. Um, and it sort of harkens back to another era when that was how we drank. It's kind of almost like making tea, really. Um, it's just a bitter liquor instead.
The evolution of it, right? I mean, it was one thing for so long. Like it's obviously been made and distilled at various distilleries, over its 100-year career, or 100-year presence. Um, but it was always just one thing. It was never, I don't know, it never part of a larger, or in the modern era, part of a larger conglomerate, where it was part of a portfolio. It was the only portfolio. It was the only one thing. And as with its current owner, branched out into other products, other Malort products, some infused with stuff. I was in Philly a couple weeks ago where we were drinking barrel-aged Malort, which was new for me.
Hmm.
5 shots of it, I don't recommend.
Wow.
Um, not not my finest day, Josh. Um, or night or next morning. Um, but it's sort of weird to me that it's branched out in the way that it has to so many different products now. Have the faithful remained faithful?
Yeah, well, one asterisk on the many products is the infusions are a limited thing and rare. Really, if you walk into the average Chicago liquor store looking for Malort, the only product you're going to see on the shelf is the good old Jepson's Malort. They did do so. There's a bar in Chicago that's been doing infusions for years. So they'll do candy cane Malort and Skittle Malort and
Yeah.
hot pepper Malort and all sorts of ridiculous things. And
Were they
then
the
Malort.
cicada ones?
No, that was a brewery. That was a different crew, and they actually got
Okay.
in trouble for that. Did you hear about that?
No, I just knew that it existed.
Yeah, they got I think fined by the state health department
For putting
for
bugs in booze.
yeah. I mean, when you put it that way, it sort of makes sense, right? But I mean, no one got sick off of it or anything. I think it was perfectly fine. But they did. There was a little backlash, but they got a lot of attention for it. So I guess it was a victory there. But so yeah, so then CH, that's the current owner, CH Distillery. They bought it in 2018 as a fundraiser last year. They did their own infusions, so they did a pumpkin spice and then a Thanksgiving version with turkey bouillon and whatever else, and then they did candy cane for around Christmas time and donated $100,000 to different nonprofits. And yes, a barrel aged comes out every once in a while. They did a collaboration with Revolution Brewing here, where they made Malort from the distillate was actually this was interesting. It was early in the pandemic, and when there were kegs all over the country just going out of code because
Right.
the on premise just closed literally overnight. Um, and so they made a version of Malort distilled from Revolution's flagship IPA, Anti-Hero. So it was Anti-Hero Malort. So there have been little larks, but the current owner has done a good job of staying true to what Malort is. I think without getting too far over the skis in terms of, and now look at this. There's been some of that, but not a ton. Anyway, what was the question?
I don't know. We
You
went
don't
off
even
on about
remember
nine. No, I
yourself.
don't even remember the question now at this point.
I
But
think
yeah,
the answer is 42.
that's a whole other book. That's another excellent book that
Oh,
everybody
right,
should
right, right.
go should go
I'll
should go and
aspire
read.
to that.
No, I guess have the faithful. The question was have the faithful kept the
Oh, that's
torch
it.
burning?
In terms of the fans,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's interesting. Malort had its punk rock moment, right? It was on the indie label. I'm about to torture a metaphor here. From about 2008 to 2015 or so, Malort was the hottest indie band in the world. Um, and now it's on a major label, and it's still making good music. See, I said I was going to torture that metaphor.
Yeah,
Um,
you did a number on it. Yeah.
um, Malort, yeah, it really did have this sort of underground kind of punk rock. You had to know about it kind of thing going. It was only in sort of the cool bars being drunk by the cool people, like, industry people and cocktail people and spirits people and beer people. And now it's everywhere. Like, nothing against traders, but traders love Malort. Nothing against law school kids, but law school kids love Malort. Like, everyone knows about Malort now in Chicago. Everyone's familiar with it. Everyone pretty much has had the experience and can talk about it and has probably an interesting story to tell. Um, so there's sort of less heat and excitement around it. Um, but it is, if anything, it sort of has burrowed deeper into the fabric of the city. It's just, I sincerely think that if you make a list of quintessential Chicago things and places, and features, you're going to think of the Cubs and deep dish pizza and hot dogs and Italian beef and the architecture and the lake and the bears. And, if you get down the list far enough, and you don't really have to go that far, you're going to get to Malort. Malort is now on that list.
Yeah.
It
but
is
20
just,
years
it is,
ago, but 20 years ago, it wasn't. And all of those other things that you mentioned certainly were.
Oh, completely. And that's part of I think that's how it was able to join the list. Is that it had, and its resurgency, which is, I get into in the book, is I tie it into sort of this broader way that we thought about the change in how we thought about what we ate and drank. Which craft beer is a huge reflection of. And farmers markets and farm to table dining and like all these things that that just barely or didn't really exist in the 80s, somewhat in the 90s, and then it really took off starting this century. Malort is Malort's rise is sort of tied in to that. Is what I would argue. And it was a complete afterthought, and it was a nothing. As I've already said a couple times, it literally could have disappeared and no one would have missed it for a second. But then once it was rediscovered, it had this. So two sort of key features to that change in how we ate and drank. One was a huge word was local, right? Mm-hmm. And Malort had the power of local. It was available only in Chicago. And that really appealed to that audience, 2008, 2009, 2010. The other thing, and this is a fuzzier concept, but it had it in spades, was authenticity. It was not some new thing that some new craft distiller had put out there trying to create a buzz. It had legitimate decades and generations of authenticity, and this crowd, again, 2008, 2009, 2010 onward, was really drawn to that, because authentic is cool, right? I mean, if it's a product made by a bunch of marketers sitting around a table in a downtown office building, well, that's not very cool. That's just someone trying to sell you something. This was authentic. This had decades of history behind it, and fuzzy history. Like, what is this stuff? I know it's been here forever, but what is it? And that became part of what propelled it and what allowed it to find its new audience in the 21st century.
I love that you've written this book. It's such a pleasure to read, and I'm obviously going to encourage everybody to go and get a copy. Before I let you go, because this is still a beer podcast, I've been asking folks on this show for
I did
while.
Write a beer book too. Do we need to talk about it?
I mean, we can. It's
actually, did we do an episode? We might have done an episode on that when that came out.
Maybe. I mean, I hope we did. I mean, it deservedly won best beer book of the year from the North American Guild of Beer Writers that year. It still remains. Again, that book has a lot of similarities as well, where you got this extraordinary access, and for a brand that, at least in the beer sphere, and then obviously through AB with Goose Island, was sort of commonplace or commonly known. The stories that you reveal in that book offered so much of a rich history and better context to the whole thing, and the Malort book does exactly the same thing. So it takes a good reporter to do that. So I'm, as always, professionally jealous of the work that you did. Very quickly, because it is a beer podcast, tell me about the Chicago handshake.
Yes. So
I don't think, because I think of all the times that I've had it, I don't know if I've ever actually had that pairing.
So that was actually the one little bit of marketing that Malort did as it was becoming popular. That guy, Sam Meckling, that I referenced before.
Yeah. Who was also a bartender at Patty Long's.
Exactly. He may have
Yeah.
served you your first
I,
toast
that's
or your first shot of Malort.
I don't remember that, but yes, it's likely.
So that was as Malort was finding its footing, there was a concern that people would try it once and then never again, so that they needed to give people a new context to order and appreciate it. So Sam, along with the folks at Old Style, I don't know how well known Old Style is beyond Chicago. Do people know what Old Style is?
I mean, I do, but
Okay. Well, Old Style, I mean,
but I
there's
also
still a
do this
lot
for
of,
a living, so yeah.
yeah. It's Old Style is just a good old school macro beer brand that's been around for I don't even know how long. Decades and generations, just like Malort. And it's big in Chicago. It was made in Wisconsin for a long time. It was served at Cubs games for a long time. So it's sort of the quintessential Chicago macro beer. So Sam got with the Old Style guys. It's owned by Pabst, by the way.
Okay.
Sam got with the Old Style guys, and they came up with this idea of the Chicago handshake, which was a shot of Malort and a cold can Old Style. And it was a clever bit of marketing that felt authentic to the brand, both brands. And it still exists today. And now you'll even see it. There's a bar in I mentioned this in the book in Denver, opened by a former Chicagoan, and she put the Chicago handshake on the menu 1,000 miles from Chicago.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a clever bit of marketing once Malort got big enough where they thought, wow, we've actually got something going on here. And I think that was in about 2015. So it was at one sort of early in the journey and a while ago at this point. But yeah, and that's still something you'll see in bars around town.
Okay.
I wouldn't say it's the definitive way to enjoy and appreciate it by any stretch, but it is a nice little clever bit of marketing.
So while you were researching this book during the pandemic and writing this book during the early years of the pandemic, I was rewatching The Good Place on television with my wife. And if you're familiar with the show, and if you're not, in the final season, they introduce a concept of the green door. And in this green door, the characters can walk through it and be anywhere, doing whatever they want to be doing. And so if we had a green door on our plane of existence and this conversation ended and you could walk through it and be at any pub or any brewery anywhere in the world, where would you want to go? Who would you want to be with? And what would you like to be drinking?
I would like to be with you continuing this conversation because it's good to catch up with you again, Mr. Holl. I'll put us how about at Russian River drinking some yummy IPAs.
Fantastic. Love it. Let's make that happen.
Okay. Yeah, that's the funny thing is we could actually do
we can actually make that happen.
Let's do it. Let's walk through that green door.
The book is called Malort, The Redemption of a Revered and Reviled Spirit. Josh Noel wrote the book. It's wonderful. It is almost available for sale now. It comes out, what, September 3rd?
September 3rd officially, but yeah, I think I've been told it might start leaking out a little bit before that. But yeah, September 3rd, 2024 is the date.
Get it wherever fine books are sold or wherever any books are sold. Go read this, enjoy this. You don't have to like the taste of Malort to enjoy this book. It is an immensely wonderful read. And Josh, thanks for writing it, and thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Great to chat with you.
What is your favorite beer to pair with Malort? Tell me about it. Email me, John Holl, JOHNHOLL @allaboutbeer.com. Questions, comments, guest suggestions, you can do all of that by emailing me. It's John Holl, that's JOHNHOLL @allaboutbeer.com. A reminder, please go visit allaboutbeer.com. There you can check out the podcast page, the merch page, and read great new content, as well as the archives going back to 1979. You can also follow All About Beer on social media @allaboutbeer, And if you're interested in supporting journalism in the beer space, email us at info@allaboutbeer.com or go to patreon.com/allaboutbeer. Don't forget, All About Beer has a podcast channel. Search and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. Steal This Beer has new episodes every Monday, and the BYO Nano podcast comes out on the 15th of every month. And don't forget to check out probrewer.com each week for original articles from the All About Beer team. As for this show, Nate Schweber does the music, Jeff Quinn designed our logo, and I'm John Holl. New episodes release every Wednesday, and that's when I'll be back again to drink beer and to think beer.